I'm Dane Rose, and in this video I want to explore the journey into, through, and moving beyond the wound in relationship with the Human Awareness Institute and various expressions. And I want to kind of step back a little bit and look at wound dynamics in any group, in any organization. And they're very common in our culture. They're very common in our world today, in part because we as a world value half of the human psyche more than the other half in both men and women. We commonly are aware of male chauvinism. But at a deeper level, one of the things that goes on in both men and women is that masculine traits, which can be best understood in a polarity of yin and yang, yang being more assertive, more outward, more initiatory, more focused, more individualistic, yin being more circular, more inward, more responsive. If you take any human dynamic, any exchange between two human beings at all, you have a polarity between a speaker and a listener, a teacher and a student, a therapist and a therapeutic patient, a parent and a child, a giver and a receiver. And on a scientific level, one cannot look at one or the other of these traits as being inherently superior or inferior. And the reason for that is one cannot exist without the other. You know, in the irony of male chauvinism, the men can't exist without the women. A speaker has zero value without a listener. A listener cannot listen without a speaker. So scientifically, these dynamics of polarity are inherently equal. But in the absurdity of some of our cult memes, we've had the audacity to ignore science and the facts of polarity, to elevate one trait over another, and then to shame people who exhibit feminine traits. Particularly men, because we're so chauvinistic that, you know, the chauvinism towards women, at least traditionally, is, well, it's assumed that because they're a woman, they wouldn't, you know, be as good as a man. But this, you know, I've felt a tremendous amount of pressure on me personally, like, you're smart, you could be dominant, you could be more assertive. Why are you so emotional? Why are, you know, because in the polarity of every thought produces a feeling, every feeling correlates with thoughts, the feelings are more feminine. So, you know, what's all this sensitivity and stuff? Why don't you go out and crush it, etc., in the chauvinism of dominance? And so at its deepest level, chauvinism hurts men as well as women. But in some ways, women are allowed to be healthier because women can hug their friends without being teased as lesbians. If they are lesbians, it's considered hot as opposed to, you know, something to be thrown stones at. And obviously, there's a generational movement. I'm 44, but I've grown up in a media where every movement, you know, in a media environment and cultural environment, where every movement towards tenderness with other men has been looked at askance, has been shamed, has been avoided. You know, a teenage boy, you know, offering to hold hands or something, making sure never to engage with me again, etc., as if we've got to avoid, you know, any expression of warmth, you know, as a disease, rather than avoid the culture that sanctions chauvinism as innately, scientifically, a diseased culture. We would consider Duracell a defunct battery company if it put out batteries with a positive charge and no negative charge, just to prove how macho it was, but there's no electricity. It's pathologically insane. Now, when you create biased maps of reality, when you create faulty maps of reality based on faulty beliefs, you get pain, you get dysfunction. And then the question is, how is that pain allocated? Is it scapegoated to a small minority, for example, homosexuals? Is it scapegoated towards the elderly? Or do children bear the brunt of our violence? Or is it dealt with as a cult? Every cult is a culture. It's a series of memes that do not often have anything at all to do with intelligence or science or the path of least resistance towards universal well-being. They're just, we do this because we do this, and we cling to this because it's our identity. And we don't want to let our identity go because we're afraid of the unknown, in part because of the pain caused by these faulty beliefs and systems. So every system has flaws. In the paradigm of culture, you have the probability field that is symmetrical, where you have these infinite refractions of the sphere, and then you have these distinctions where every cult, every culture elevates certain pieces and says this is who we are, and we're not these things. We're outgoing and make it happen people. We're not present, warm. Those are people to be made fun of on sitcoms, and it's a dysfunctional cult, and every dysfunctional cult has a statistical trail behind it. How many rapes per 1,000 happen in this cult? How many people feel heard and valued in this cult? How many people feel they're prepared to engage with life in a meaningful way? How many people love and are excited about their jobs versus how many people hate their jobs? How many people are in relationships because they're afraid they wouldn't survive on their own, or they're trying to do one-upmanship as opposed to truly caring about their person? Every cult produces a database, a statistical base, that says these beliefs and these habits produce these results, positive and negative. And no cult is all positive, no cult is all negative. But all cults tend to punish divergence, particularly insecure cults, tend to punish minorities, which are in fact, in evolutionary terms, always the bleeding edge. If you want to find the next wave of innovation, integrity, excellence in any area, you're going to look to a minority because that's where it is. The bleeding edge, by definition, is the smallest part of the blade, but it's the sharpest. It's the blade that's leading the part to the future. And so one of the ways we can measure the amount of self-love in a given cult is how it treats its minorities. Because somewhere in those minorities are that cult's future. In a dysfunctional cult, in a culturally illiterate cult, a cult that doesn't know how to step outside of itself and say, they've got a good ritual over here in Zimbabwe for dealing with grief. We don't have anything on that. Why don't we benefit from them and learn from, getting the full grief out of the system? But no, in simplistic cults, we hang to our identity. This is who we are, and fuck anyone who says we're number one at doing this, whether it works or not, and independent of data. And this gets reduced to ridiculous little apple pie, where Americans mom apple pie, and it's like, what is that got to do? We eat a lot of sugar, we're fat, why is that the identity? Well, it's just little memes, little simple things that make complicated expressions palatable to an absent-minded mind. And so we can see the wound in the cult in, for example, the escalating number of Americans who are lonely and do not have a single friend to confide in. And it's very important to understand, to break the taboo of the cult, which is the obsession with the individual. If you're lonely, why are you lonely? If you're angry, why are you angry, and ignore the culturally sanctioned beliefs and habits that produce a harvest. You plow a field and plant wheat, mostly you're going to get wheat. And if you ask the wheat, why are you wheat? Why didn't you turn out to be an oat? It's like, well, this is what gets created. You don't ask someone coming home broke after placing 100 bets in Vegas, why are you part of the 98% of people who leave Vegas with less money than you arrived at? You might say, knowing that that's a dysfunctional environment for making money, why did you take your rent money to Vegas? That'd be a more, salient question, not why did you lose? That's somewhat inherent in the environment. And this is a challenge to individualism, this focus that somehow you could be an oat plant, in a monocrop of wheat. And if you're not, why didn't you do that? And the wound begins with faulty beliefs, which create a certain amount of pain. Beliefs like I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable, things that come in the childhood wounds of having lots of children with zero parental training. You have the right to have an innocent human being in your hands and follow the cult memes, and not receive any training. If you want to drive a car, cars are important, so you have to learn how to drive a car safely. Kids, just do what everyone else is doing, which of course ensures the statistics that the rest of people are getting. So you get pain with faulty beliefs. Pain leads to fear. Fear of what? Fear of the pain in the past being created into the future. With pain and fear comes shame. Particularly when you have a blame cult, that says, if you feel pain, it's your fault. We like winners, we don't like losers. And we don't want to deal with the complexity in that polarity, where losers usually become the best winners. But we don't want to deal, we don't want to deal with the stage where you're losing. We're not going to put you on CNN and say, tell us about your failure this week and what we could all learn from it. That would be intelligent. But no. Let's throw you out. You were winning last week, but now there's the new person that's winning, and let's celebrate always one side without the other, and ignore the innate interconnectedness. And so when failure becomes part of shame, you end up with more failure because you're not bringing it out into the open for learning. You don't have a good iterative feedback environment. You have a shame environment, which also often leads to betrayal because of secrecy, because nobody wants to be caught in that bad, hated, undervalued, uncool group, which our cult produces. We produce a spectrum of people. And then we take large segments of it and say, well, you're no good for this and you're no good for this, much like we do with our things. We produce a large amount of energy. We consume more natural resources than any culture in human history. 102 metric tons is the legacy that you and I, as Americans, are going to leave in the landfills at our death, meaning that for this, 150-pound body, there's going to be 2 tons. Now, 102 tons. 102 tons. If you compare this to the Native Americans, did they leave even a ton of unbiodegradable anything that wasn't useful and sacred for something? But we're leaving 102 tons. And much like we do with our minorities and the feelings and thoughts we don't know how to deal with, we dig a big hole and we bury them. And there is a symmetry of heart, mind, and body. And so it's worth learning in a materialistic culture, what are we doing with all this stuff that we make that we don't know what to do with? Well, let's just dig a big hole and bury it. And not in my backyard. Let's bury it in someone else's, because I don't want the shame. I don't want anything ugly or dirty, etc. And there you have again the chauvinism. You get the idea that, someone might, obsess about the flowers, but not want the roots that produce those flowers anywhere near them. It's like, oh, that's so dirty and muddy. Let's leave those for the lower classes to do, because we want the flower, but we're too illiterate to understand to get the flower, you tend the root. You tend the soil if you want a crop of beautiful flowers. But again, in the chauvinism, you don't. We just want this while we chop away at and damage our soils, etc. And so we get a system of denial, because then there's secrecy. So then we have to deny that we had anything to do with, the fact that the math doesn't add up. When you try and delete the feminine and over-escalate the masculine when they can't exist without the other, the math is fuzzy. So you get a culture of secrecy and denial, which ultimately leads to insanity. And generally, cultural patterns are fractal. If you want to understand what's going on in your family, one place to look is the U.S. government. How do they share power? How do they get things done? Who gets elected and why? Well, it's usually about the same. Who's the head of the House? Why do they get to do their thing? Was the bill really for the best interest of the family? Or did that let so-and-so get important and squander, important resources for the family that, weren't important because, the breadwinner, in a chauvinistic system, the person who has more money is more valuable, because in a chauvinistic system, money is more important than the human beings who have it. Thus, you get things like homelessness. Why are they homeless and miserable? Well, they don't have money. So you mean they would be taken care of if they had money? Yeah. Well, why aren't they taken care of without money? Well, they're not important. Their money is important. We're not trying to help people. We're trying to extract money, and they're too dumb to have any, so we can't extract it. So we don't want anything to do with them. They're a liability. Human beings are a liability. The golden goose that lays the egg is unimportant. It's the egg that matters. And of course, we have little children's parables to remind us of our stupidity, but who wants to listen to children's parables when we're all so sophisticated and graduates from college? And so we have a betrayal, a denial, an insanity. And we have a cult that doesn't want to look at itself. And so, as a general rule, we can look at our own ego, for example, as a microcosm of the family dysfunction. This part of me has a secret, that part covers it up. This part says, I won't tell your secret if you don't do this. This part says, oh, I'd like to be this is my true self, but I don't want anyone to know because that's feminine, or that doesn't fit the normal box. And so, from the ego to the family, to the local power structure, to the government, to the species at large, we can look at the sophistication of the inner dialogue refracted at multiple Zoom settings. And that's the gift you're able to get. It's very hard to see usually objectively inside oneself, but if you just ask yourself, where's the me that kind of behaves and feels like Donald Trump, or where's the me that blames a Donald Trump in me, and how does that happen? For example, a Donald Trump, you have to have a young boy with an abusive father surrounded by fearful employees that champion his father and his money over the innate value of the young boy. You don't get people this obsessed about money, and it's a miserable job. You don't get people that obsessed with getting social rank if they feel an innate sense of value. You do get that if you're bullied, hit, and your only value to your father is if you make money and look big. Well, that's what we get. No one intervened in that pattern when he was a young boy. No one intervened in Hitler's pattern. No one intervened if you look at the deep psychology and so many of our atrocious leaders. They're basically hurt boys that didn't get the message that they were valuable for themselves. Well, the value of that playing out on a world stage is not to dissociate and say, I'm so glad I'm so much more spiritual than any of those people. If I was president, or if I was, I would be so much more evolved. You think if your neighbors were president, or your neighbor, this is part of the insanity. It's part of the shadow aversion. And so if we step down to the level of the Human Awareness Institute, we have a power structure. We have the facilitators, the board of directors, and the team. This is the three power structures within HIGH, and they exist within the larger power structure. And so the question becomes, how do I, as a participant wanting to grow, wanting to learn, realizing that I don't know what the fuck I'm doing because, I'm smart enough to have watched my parents and understand that I'd rather not have any relationship at all rather than do what they did. And, much like the governmental system, they never did anything wrong. Their children had ruined their life. They would have been so, if only their children had been more evolved, these poor parents wouldn't have, been irresponsible, wouldn't have been miserable and all that. And so you have the same blame games in Washington. And, it's pretty clear that I needed to learn. And so I asked one therapist, Lauren Campbell, where do I go to learn how to have a healthy, loving relationship? I'm 28 years old. I want to learn. I want to learn how to do this well. He said, well, there's this place called HIGH. You might check it out. So I checked it out, and I did 100 HIGH events. I worked with 4 different facilitators: Barbara Musser, Sarah Sandhill, Ann Watts, mostly Ann Watts, and Peter Sandhill. And my first choice was Peter Sandhill because he was the first person who picked an older woman. And I'd gotten flack about that in part of the craziness that is our culture. Men, of course, would choose tits and ass over intelligence and maturity, of course, because, well, we don't even ask. Why? Why on earth would you think the pertness of breasts is more important than the sophistication of self-awareness that comes with a 50-year-old woman who's been around and gotten to know herself in an emotionally illiterate culture? Well, you're not going to learn that in high school because that would be too intelligent. And so, so Peter Sandhill chose an older woman. I was just leaving a relationship with a 58-year-old woman, my first relationship at starting at age 26, ending at age 28. I thought I was smart to pick someone who knew what they were talking about and who was a great conversationalist. You spend much more time talking than you do having sex. So why not pick your majority activity and make that excellent? And for the few hours a week you're having sex, make that as good as you can. But, is that really, is that really maturity to just, chase after, adolescent fantasies and stuff? So Peter Sandhill was married to Sarah, and I thought, this is the first time I haven't gotten flack, because I didn't go for body size either. My 58-year-old woman was a bit plump. It was a very good relationship in the context of this culture. But why was I with this woman? Something no, I would not have been asked as a 58-year-old man with a 26-year-old woman. And so there again so I went with Peter, and I noticed an erection in the first 5 minutes of entering his room. He's wearing little white sweatpants, big bulge. I've learned at my first few HIGH workshops to be direct, right? And so I say, Peter, is that an erection? He says, yes. I say, why? He says, I'm attracted to you. I say, what's that about? You see, already I'm out of my depth because I've grown up watching gay people be abused traumatically, sociopathically. This is a terrifying field to move towards because I don't want to be stoned to death. I don't want to be dragged by a gang behind a pickup truck. I don't want to be humiliated or anything. I don't think it makes any sense to obsess on which gender you fall in love with, but there's a lot of fear, particularly as a traumatized child, with parents who, like our culture, of course, never did anything wrong. And when the parents don't make mistakes, and so they never do anything wrong. They, of course, don't apologize, and their final request is, would you mind going insane and calling all this love? Because we're not really, well, we don't want to do all the work to learn how to love you competently so that you feel loved. That's a lot of work, and where would we learn it in this culture anyway? But we don't want to feel bad, and so we're going to do what we do and what's generally happening around us. You're going to feel all kinds of pain and misery and shame and loneliness and all this, and be induced into various states of trauma at different times because we don't know what we're doing. But would you mind, we'll give you a little bit of dessert or some ice cream or something, if you would tell us what great parents we are and how loving all this is, which just buries the whole dynamic. You cannot deal with a dynamic without language because you can't think. You can't think a single thought without putting it into words. I mean, it's one of the ways we're reduced to the biases of our cult is if you can't think a thought without words. And each cult is slanted. For example, the Eskimos have 400 words for snow. Wouldn't it be nice if we had 400 words for love? We don't. So love is a big jumble. But, the elemental table or, fiscal policy, there's lots of language for that. And we generally do a decent job. I mean, we're a capitalist culture in which 7 out of 10 small businesses fail. 7 out of 10 businesses that start fail, but we just keep starting other ones until we're making money. And so we're a little bit more intelligent in that domain. So what do? And this is where Peter Sandhill fails. First of all, he's breaking his marital agreements. Sarah is not interested in this. How do I know? He tells me. Secondly, he's breaking his high agreements. You don't escalate a sexual relationship with a patient. And part of it is this. Peter knows nothing about me. Within 5 minutes, he's talking about what's good for him. He wants an open relationship. He is bisexual. Bisexual, open relationship. I don't know anything about this. But of course, in the chauvinism, our culture, it's not what's good for the citizens, it's what's good for President Trump. It's not what's good for the child, it's what makes the parent feel good. It's how can you be used for the parent's needs, not how can we sacrifice our shames, our fears, our delusions, our insanity to validate your sanity, to validate that, yes, you are growing up in an emotionally illiterate cult. We didn't learn anything about relationships in marriage in school. Our parents were even more fucked up than we were. So, even if we do our best, we're not going to 10x this. We'll do moderately better than the generation before. And it hurt as hell. That's why we don't have any feelings in this family. We like talking about metaphysics, but no feelings. No intense emotions. Let's just go off into our head in various ways. And don't you have feelings either, because if you do, we might get sucked in and feel some of our own feelings, and that would be dreadful. We'd remember our own child. We don't want to do it. Shut up. Don't have feelings. All this is love. So and then you get into the culture. Does your client want to learn what hurt as a child? Does anyone want to unpack all of the waves of abuse that goes on in a childhood that turns us into chauvinistic, dissociative, traumatized, shame-based individuals that are terrified of what's inside us because everyone else is and we don't want to be punished? Who's going to deal with that? And this is, of course, what a therapist is supposed to do. But Peter Sandhill doesn't have boundaries and disclosure and competency. Stan Dale apparently said he was good enough for him, so there you have it. No license, but that's not going to be disclosed. We're here to help. We're here to love you. Do you want to be helped? Do you want to be loved? Okay, sign up and pay our fee. So I drive an hour to see Peter. I drive an hour. I take time off work. I pay hundreds of dollars. And I get thrown out of my depths into more emotional dissociation and confusion because this is not about helping me. It's not about unpacking any of this. It's about Peter Sandhill's interest in an open relationship with me, a homosexual virgin, And pretty soon he wants me to take MDMA with him in his house because it would be good for me. And all I have to do is pay him $600 and we'll do it together. Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't it be great if we could all find the people we were attracted to, have them pay us $600, and then see what happens? We'd be richer. They have to come to our house. Probably some nice sex comes out of it. Wouldn't it be great? It's just so unethical in terms of the statistical data within the therapeutic community about what creates integration and health for the client. And here we have to go into, some of the roles, because we have the innocence and trust by the student paying money for help. That's one of the dynamics here. Then we have a public nonprofit with a mission and a contract with the state and the public to put public interest first. Then we have the role of the individual therapist, taking money to teach and to lead. We have the team volunteering on the basis that they want more love in the world. They want something good to happen. I don't think anyone on team says, I think I'd like to fuck the world up. Let's volunteer my time. No, they're believing in the mission and wanting to help. And you have the culture. We have the possible culture we can create, and we have the wounded culture that we have, and we have me. We have me in this dynamic, finding myself in an increasingly uncomfortable position. I don't want Sarah to be upset with me. But whatever's going on in that relationship, Peter's sharing that Sarah is not happy about his idea of drugs, and she's not happy about his interest in me, but he thinks it's a good idea anyway, which is pitting me against a former therapist of my own. And she's not going to the board of directors, or she's not going to the other facilitators and saying, wait a minute, we made a mistake here. This is not good ethics. 99% of all sexual relationships with therapists do not end well for the participant. So how is there a world where everyone wins if there's a 99% chance of you losing? Well, this whole thing felt terrible. And so I withdrew. But I withdrew wearing the mantle that this was all done in a magnanimous state of love, which just it's reinforcing the parental confusion. It's not unpacking it. Because that was my parents' game. Let's be fucked up parents and blame it on the kids and call it love. Well, let's be fucked up therapists and blame it on the students and call it love. The only difference is your parents paid for you to survive, etc. You've got to pay your therapist to get fucked up. That's the difference. So there's a deeper measure of worthlessness, and there's a deeper message of it's not safe. There's also a deeper distortion in what love is. Because Peter ended the whole thing saying, I'm totally in support of you. And I ended it saying, I feel terrible and I don't know why I'm behaving so weirdly, but the only thing I know is I'm only behaving this way around you, and I don't need to pay money to do that. But neither Peter and Sarah had the ethics to unpack that. They didn't have, you see, there's a cycle between love and competency. And that cycle goes, you feel a love, you feel an attraction. And if you're a whole human being, the next stage in that process is you feel a deeper caring for the object of your love and affection. You have a caring. And because you care, you learn. This is what didn't happen about me. There was attraction, but there was no caring to learn. Like, what's it like for you, Dane? What are the body symptoms that come up when you think of having an open homosexual relationship with your therapist? Oh, anxiety, uncertainty, this, that. I don't want people to judge me. I don't want this. And all that needs to be unpacked before something like that has any possibility of going anywhere healthy. And it needs to be attuned to me. We're in a vertical relationship. This is the same dynamic. Why it's generally not good for the secretary to have sex with her boss. There are power dynamics because of the imbalance of the therapeutic relationship. It's actually a bit ironic here because Peter opened up about his needs and wants more than he ever asked me about mine. And so, but in a typical therapeutic relationship, the patient is totally open and the therapist is closed, which makes the patient very vulnerable to influences and needs and suggestions of the therapist. Because often our cult teaches us to shame and fear large parts of our own psyche. So if we open up to a therapist in that domain, we don't know if that's safe or not. And what we're looking for in a healthy therapist is to say, what you're feeling is completely right, completely healthy, and understandable, and here's why you're feeling that way. And, if we were in a healthier culture, we'd all be talking about this. We're not in a healthy culture. That's not your fault. But here's, and then you say, it's okay to love these parts of me. Someone's figured it out. I'm not crazy, that I have sensitive feelings, and I'm not a tough guy or whatever. And so that's what's supposed to happen. And that's why you cannot have someone in the role of that amount of power and influence who has personal agendas that transcend your best interest, which has to be informed with intimacy. Care leads to intimacy. Into me you see. And you take time to learn who the person is and what their cultural framework is. And, did you ever see a homosexual get killed because they were homosexual? Are you afraid you'd die if you're homosexual? Do you think you unpack that? The wounding of our cult hits the body, lands in the body, traumatizes the body, and has to be navigated through to come back to a sense of authenticity. That doesn't happen. So I feel more and more bottled up. He didn't unpack illegality either. He's asking me to break the law, take drugs which I've never taken in my entire life. I've never been drunk. When you're traumatized as a child, you're terrified of being out of control because you were out of control so much of the time. The last thing you want to be doing is waking up and wondering what happened. So no drugs, no alcohol, nothing. It's a big risk. Why am I trusting Peter Sandhill? Well, I've experienced some good things at the High Workshop, and every one of those female facilitators is telling me how great Peter is. Every single one of the facilitators who have told me they are committed to a world where everyone wins, and I should hire Peter because he's great. Do I want someone who's great? Of course I do. But what is great exactly? Well, we're not going to get into that. Nor are we going to get into what sexual abuse is. Nor are we going to define why something is and isn't abusive. You see, and we're even going to cover it. We're going to say that if you are at choice, you are at choice. If you're at choice, it's not abuse. So the only thing to guide in the high paradigm is you ask permission for something. The other person says yes or no. If they say yes, it's fine. If they say no, it isn't. But this doesn't actually work. Because we as a public, in an emotionally and relationally and psychologically and traumatically illiterate culture, do not know what paths lead to statistical well-being and which paths don't. That's why we're going to a professional. We don't know. If we knew, we might not need the professional. So in that dynamic, Peter expresses sexual interest to me. I don't know at the time that 99% of all sexual relationships with a therapist end in disaster for me, for my demographic. I don't know that it is completely inappropriate for a homosexual virgin to have his first homosexual experience with a therapist, with a prostitute, because I'm paying for money. I'm paying for the time. And Peter's whole deal was it's all got to happen in container, etc., or at team workshop, or this. How do I feel about prostitution? The cult has deluged me with shame and derision on this word, which is the word when you pay someone to be your lover. I'm paying Peter. He wants to be my lover, and he wants me to pay him. What is that? So we have we have all these explosions of cultural bombardments that are not getting unpacked, but that are pushing me into a terrifying... I had no idea my first 5 minutes with Peter would be an erection. How was I? Because that was not laid out. Now, I know I'm at choice, and I know I feel terrible, and so eventually I bow out. So was I at choice? Peter didn't abuse me, right? Because I was at choice. He said he wanted this. I said no. I was at choice. If I'd said yes, though, you see, high doesn't have a distinction that goes beyond were you at choice. And this is where we get into beliefs and models of reality that are dysfunctional from the beginning, that create massive and massive amounts of pain. Because every abuse that I experienced within the high community and the 30 lovers that I explored with were at choice, meaning I took that to heart. I remembered that bit. So I did what I learned. I asked for my 100%. I asked permission. I had a safe sex conversation. And people said yes when it wasn't good for them. And I didn't know what to do. What high does is it generally suggests there's something wrong with the person who said yes when they should have said no, rather than that there's something wrong with escalating sexuality in a group of people by 500% as a general demographic. That's that's certainly my own figure. My own sexuality went way over 500% more than the early sexuality, and I don't think there's anyone that would argue that being at a high workshop escalates the probability of sex. But if you escalate the probability of sex, much like escalating the probability of driving out on the highway in a fast race car, you not only need to have brakes and need to know how to operate them, you need to know when to operate them, which means you need to know family system dynamics, you need to know abuse dynamics, you need to know about sexual addiction, you need to know about substance addiction. You need to know how to have a safe emotional conversation that creates a container for what's likely to erupt. And a container has a strong middle, beginning, and end that is mutual and that is healthy. You need to know the art of building containers. And you need to know that abuse survivors don't know when to say yes and when to say no, and you need to know why. Because when daddy sticks his penis into you and says, you like this, right? And then he gets angry when you say, no, I don't like this, go away. And then he blames you because you want to tell mom. And he says, you're going to break your mother's heart, not me. I'm not an adult, ruining my child's psyche, ruining my marriage, stepping in, putting you into a dirty, shame-based secrecy, dumping my incompetence on you. No. You, the little 5-year-old, the 10-year-old, you're the problem. So are you going to ruin the whole family's life? And to give all the power to the child. No, what do I have to do? Well, you say nothing. You don't do this and this. Okay, Daddy. Okay. I don't want you mad at me. I don't want you hating me. I don't want you hitting me. I don't want you hitting Mom. So I'll say yes when I mean no. Now, the amount of sexual abuse and sexual abuse survivors is quite high within the high community. I've had at least 10 kind of detailed and horrific sexual abuse narratives with high women who did not know what that meant, meaning they didn't say, because of this and this, you need to do this and not do this. And I didn't say, because you've told me this. I said, so what is it? What do you want? Yes, no? What's your yes and no here? Well, many of them said yes. And I said, that it doesn't feel right. And they said, well, this, and I'm like, I don't know what to do here because I'm illiterate with a large demographic of this community where sex is escalating, but emotional awareness is not. So I didn't know that what Peter was doing was abuse to me or abuse to anyone else, and I didn't know that I was incompetent to assess whether or not I was being abusive or not, without a safe emotional conversation, without having some context of history, and without having some training about the psychology of abuse, which I received anti-training to protect my parents, because they could, of course, have the decency to say what we did here was wrong, what we did here was shame-based, what we did here was sociopathic, what we did here was traumatic, but that would have involved them sacrificing their self-image for the well-being of their children, something they didn't want to do. And so they just called that love. Well, I loved a number of people the way my parents loved me and the way that Peter Sandhill loved me, and I thought I was doing it right. I always had a safe sex conversation. I always asked for my 100%. I always invited them to ask for their 100%. I always asked for verbal permission. I always respected the yeses and nos. And abuse would happen. Why? What's wrong with me? What's going on? And often I would push them away because I didn't know how to deal with the situation, which often abused them further. The shame-based abuse survivor gets the message that when daddy and mom don't love them or push them away because they feel guilty for being crappy parents, that there's something wrong with them. And the parents aren't big enough to own up. And the rejected, abused lover, again, gets the message again that there's something so flawed with them, that no healthy, good... And so they would apologize for me and say, I know I'm crappy, I'm worthless and stuff like this, but, please don't push me away. I'm like, I don't know how to deal with this. You're not crappy, you're not worthless. I'm not saying you're crappy and worthless. I'm saying I'm scared. I don't want to be hurt and I don't want to hurt you. And this is not working. I'm asking for what I want. I'm listening. I'm checking in, but I'm watching your face. Your face is terrified right now. Why? Why are you terrified if I'm doing exactly what you say you want? No, my face is not terrified. Nothing's going on. That's the response of a terrified person. Something is definitely going on. No, don't leave me. A terrified child, induced into intense sexuality with a dysfunctional protocol that leads to pain, failure, shame, and secrecy. Don't tell anyone this and don't do this. They feel worse off than ever after that. I don't want to do it. How do I avoid this? So I ultimately end up in a suicidal place. It is a human need to have love and belonging. At our best, none of us want to hurt other people. None of us want to see the people we're closest to having escalated pain and trauma. We don't want to have escalated pain and trauma, and that happened a lot. And what I learned was that no team member, no facilitator, no lover at high knew how to recognize traumatic symptoms in me and knew how to take care of me better than I knew how to take care of myself, which was not adequate using High's protocol. And when you have a protocol that ignores addiction, ignores abuse, ignores the distinctions of violations, doesn't go into trauma, doesn't recognize traumatic symptoms, doesn't do anything, you have a system ripe for rampant abuse and fear. Fear of the pain. you're caught in this loop. Everyone wants to connect. Everyone wants to be more loving. This is the room of love. But then there's this trauma. Then there's this betrayal. Then there's this. What's going on? Well, go back to ask for your 100%. Have a safe sex conversation. Come to another high workshop. It goes round and round, and the pain builds up, and it's too big. I feel I'm hurting someone, and I don't know why. I'm being hurt deeply, and I don't know what to do about it. And so I began improvising. Let's have ending agreements so that we're not traumatizing each other in ending agreements. Let's map stuff out. But because the community was not induced into these healthy relationship practices, these would feel strange. And we're a country that doesn't like weird, which is anything that the norm isn't doing. In a certain sense, we're more comfortable. We're more comfortable going through a dysfunctional system that we know than we are doing something very different that, like, maybe I'll fail. And if I fail, I'll be shamed and punished. So I don't want to try anything new, even if it's... And so this, again, is huge frustration. Why won't you tell me what's going to hurt you and what's not before we have sex? No, it's in the past. I don't want to do that. And then they would leave me. And I'd feel like I'm being punished for trying to care for them. It's exhausting. Like everything I try, this. So I'm suicidal. Who was the one who said I should take drugs with him 10 years ago and that this was loving? Well, Peter Sandhill. I've never done drugs. Could it help? Is it worth trying some psychedelic therapy before dying? And keep in mind, love and belonging is a need. I didn't find a secure way to meet that need within my framework with high. I felt afraid of going round and round again, and I felt tremendously lonely, traumatized, and a lot of pain. There was no place to bring that within this system. Just ask for your 100%, honor the yeses and nos, go out and have sex and join the room of love. It's not adequate. You know, it's like an auto school where people are crashing in to the pillars one after another and told just put on the accelerator, go out, take some runs around the track, and just come back and get a new car if you've crashed the pillars. And but not learning how to navigate the most tricky terrain. And as the comedians point out, it's easy doing the anger techniques when you're not angry. It's easy telling the truth when you're not regressed and traumatized. It's easy being yourself when you're not in an attachment abuse contract. But that's not the problem, is it? Because the power of deep connections is the deeper the connection, the more the dysfunction wants to come to consciousness to be healed. But you've got to have a paradigm that's capable of understanding it, recognizing, and working with it. So I hire Peter Sandhill to be my first psychedelic journey. And I go deeper into the wound. Because he begins that without any preparation and intimacy either. Because remember the circle which I began, love leads to caring. Caring leads to investing the time to understand and to see. When you understand and see, you love and care enough to attune. Then you love and care enough to get feedback. Feedback, understanding, and care lead to competency. Competency leads to well-being, to more success. More success and well-being leads to a feeling of trustworthiness and trust, a feeling of safety, a feeling of openness, a feeling of gratitude and joy, which leads back to love. Meaning there is no love if there's no competency, because you haven't loved enough to go through the journey. Saying I love you, I just want to ruin your life by violating all these things and it feels great and then I'm done with you. That's not love. That's, a lust-based addiction perhaps, but you're not even loving enough to care. You're not caring enough to see. And that takes time, which is the other biggest, friction point with me and the high community. The single biggest thing that I got rejected for was asking for time, because I had learned that without time I could not track what was and what was not going on. And it would lead to escalations of energy faster than I could understand how to navigate the container, and faster than the other person could understand how to care and love for the tenderness that is me. Lots of people wanted to have sex. Very few people wanted to have a safe, emotional conversation about that, and to hold the relationship in a container adequate to deal with the escalated volatility and intensity of vulnerability and emotion, which includes the area of the wound. If you're in this culture, you are a carrier of some of its cultural wounds in various states of unconsciousness, in various states of integration, in various states of repair. But you don't get to be born in this culture and adopt to its memes and ways of thinking without being highly chauvinistic, without being highly shame-based, which is highly secret and pain-based. Now, you can numb it, you can put on good faces, you can do a whole host of things that are the adaptive coping mechanisms of pain. But they're not love. You can't let love in those states. You can't be loving. We don't even know what love is. I like to use the definition: if you love someone, regardless of whether you're in lust with them or need them or anything like that, if you love someone and want to be loving, you behave in a way that helps them to survive. That if their survival needs are not being met, you help facilitate their survival physically. You help them in a way, you interact with them in a way that strengthens their odds of certainty in survival. Which means love can be, problem solvings around homelessness or things of that nature, or how to develop more savings. The hierarchy of human needs, as Abraham Maslow spells them out, are survival, security, love and belonging, self-esteem, developing unique personal gifts and reaching your potential, bringing those out into the community, experiencing the abundance that comes and the success of learning to bring those successfully in the community, and transcending the obsession with the self to leave a legacy, to make a difference in something bigger than oneself, a spirituality, a cultural gift, a charitable organization, a teaching. You turn your attention as an elder, as a human need, to something bigger than the individual ego, and we all need to go on that journey. And if a romantic relationship sabotages that growth process, it is not a loving relationship. Maybe a lust, an addiction, whatever, a dysfunction, a craziness. It's not a loving relationship. And if you are, whether you can't stand the person, whether you have no interest in having sex, if you are committed if you love enough to learn and understand the person, and you help them progress through their human needs, survival, security, love and belonging, sense of self-esteem, developing their unique gifts, blossoming, you are loving that person. And when you love someone, if they associate you, that person really helped me develop my gifts and see who I am and bring that into the world. And they're there as a champion for that. I may not want to have sex with you or this, that, and the other. That has, that's a different region in the brain. But I'm grateful. That's a person who's my ally. If you're wired properly, if your parents have cross-wired you so that abuse is love and love is abuse, you may think that person doesn't care for you at all. Why aren't they fucking you in the bathroom and this and that and the other? This isn't love. And that's the danger, again, of cross-wiring, which, again, we don't learn at high. And so, having hired, Peter Sandhill for my psychedelic session, the first thing he did was glossed over the pain he caused before, because that's what came out. And that's a violation of the therapeutic ethics. The next thing he did was told me he had, again, made a secrecy barrier with Sarah, and he was turning me into a secret keeper. The way he did that is he said, I didn't tell Sarah this was a psychedelic session. I thought it would be less complicated that way. So he's immediately polarizing me against a support person. That's abuse. You're there for maximum support with all your facilitators. You don't want to divide and polarize. Well, Peter was systematically turning me into an enemy. When he pushed for a high dose, he was again violating the psychedelic ethics. You don't push people in faster than works. It doesn't generally end up as good as letting people set their own pace. So he's going into deeper and deeper. When I fell in love with him because after the high dose of mushrooms, he suggested taking MDMA. And with MDMA and a dissociative amount of mushrooms, I fell in love with my therapist for the first time, the first male, all that. He didn't say, "Ups, I need to do my job at $175 an hour, and I can't break my high agreements because then you will be an enemy of high. And this is your support network." No, he just dove right in. Where he fought me was anything healthy. He fought me around the dose. I said lower dose, he said higher dose. I said lower dose, he said higher dose. He fought me once I fell in love with him. I said he should take money out of it so he wouldn't be a prostitute. No, he wouldn't. He betrayed Sarah, but then he used Sarah as the excuse to charge. He said he told Sarah he would bring back money. And so he had to keep his agreement with Sarah about taking my money to be a lover, but he didn't have to keep his agreement with Sarah to be don't turn your clients into a secret. Don't give them secrets in your marriage. They're not there to hold your marital dysfunction. Yes, this is a cult filled with marital dysfunction. But if you have the audacity to be a therapist and have a dysfunctional marriage based on secrecy, at the very least, don't burden your clients with that. I'm now a threat. And Sarah doesn't know how to deal with this either, because Peter withdraws when you challenge him on shit. And he withdraws usually after there's an attachment. So Sarah's attached with him. I'm now attached with him. Drugs do that. And he'll withdraw if you aren't complying with his secrecy protocols, with his various... He needs to look great is the bottom line. And so that's what he lays out, how great he is in this and this and this. And then he systematically ignores how he's undermining the entire relationship by underlying the statistics of success. If you as a professional, like if I'm a plumber, and I say, you really ought to put your house at 300 psi. That'll give you nice pressure in your house, and so, okay, you turn it up to 300 psi, and of course, one of the fittings burst. They're designed for 65 psi. It's like, oh, well, I was rooting for you getting that, the shower pressure, and these things happen, but why don't you pay the $300,000 to replace all the hardwood floors in the basement and this and that and the other from top to bottom? Because I was just trying to help, and this is another message: you don't matter. It's the underlying abuse dynamic. So Peter doesn't show up on time for his first session of integration after I'm freaking out because this whole thing was pushing way past boundaries. I get furious at Peter. He's the only therapist never to show up on time and not communicate and stuff. He wouldn't even answer the phone and say, I'm going to be late. Has any therapist ever... I don't know the therapists you've dealt with. I've dealt with dozens. They've never done that. Who dreamed that right after the highest psychedelic experience, And so Peter doesn't like, being the bad guy. So he charges me to process my anger at him for betraying, because he said he was going to be there, right? Take the high dose, I'm going to be there for you. And then he's the only therapist to be late for the very first session, which tells me he doesn't even have control of his time. He's that flaky, and yet I'm now in this whole universe of stuff that I don't know how to deal with on my own, and I'm realizing how incompetent my guide is. he doesn't love me enough to get competent. If he did, he might have read a few psychedelic books before saying, oh, I'm great at that too, even though I'm not licensed in that either. He would have cared and learned and done this and said, you're right, let's take it slow. There's plenty of time. You haven't pinched me on money or anything like this. Let's do this the best way for you, because you matter. Love leads to competency, and competency leads to love. Insanity leads to betrayal, pain, and hate, which, when then further betrayed, leads down to trauma and PTSD, because that's just normal. You trust a rock climber to take you up a mountain, and he hightails it when you're up at the top and can't see in the middle of the night, and you hate that son of a bitch, and you're trying to make sure he doesn't do that to the next person because he doesn't know what he's doing. And so in the process, and I've outlined this much more in other places, I'm entering High's wound, the wound of not training facilitators, not teaching safe emotional conversations, not getting to learning your patients before, expressing sexual interest, not going cautiously on someone's first altered state experience in their whole life, including never being drunk, not learning about that. Why should we learn about our clients? We've got the typical chauvinism, oh, you look hot, I want to fuck you. And how much abuse happens in our culture with, dozens of men chasing this very small group of often, highly abused women who don't know how to love themselves in that situation and desperately don't want to repeat the dynamic that, they find themselves thrust in over and over again, and men punishing them for leading them on. And it's just a nightmare for them. But we don't learn any of that at a school for love, intimacy, and sexuality, because that would be intelligent. That would work. We need to understand these databases to have empathy and to know what's going on. And the only way to learn that I've found is to get severely hurt and then try and take on personal corrective measures that then the rest of the community doesn't fully understand because it's not part of the curriculum. And much more importantly, it's one thing if you go to a body paint shop and they say, we're a body paint shop. You are not, if you've got faulty brakes, we have not fixed your car. You see, we know this in mechanics because we're a materialist culture, but we don't know this in relationship. You go to a healer, and what do they say? They're healing you. Good to go. You're looking radiant. They don't say you've still got complex PTSD, you've still got attachment disorder, you have a trigger point here which we haven't mapped out, and you need to go and see these and these and these people. You don't know it, they don't know it, they don't care enough to find out, you don't know enough to find out. So it's like, well, they said I was great, now I lost my job. What was that about? Oh, come back and see another healer. It's very, very vague. It's the kind of vagueness where you could go into an auto body, have your car painted up nicely, and think that the brakes would work better this time and crash into a pole and ruin your paint job because it looked good on the surface. And there's no distinctions beneath all this. And it's worse because there's no these are all the books you should be reading to fill in the gaps that we're not going to teach you about. These are the books you need to know to succeed. We're not going to cover them, but we're not going to recommend them either. We're going to say this is the room of love. Does everyone want love? Okay, come here. Now, if loving things don't happen, you can go hire one of us as untrained, unlicensed therapists. Let's see what happens there. If it doesn't work, then you don't get a refund. You can try another one. That leads to shame and failure in a certain statistical amount of time. When you go into the paint body shop and you're lucky enough to only need a paint job, then you're happy because you needed a paint job, you went to a paint shop. But if you need a set of new brakes and you go to a paint shop, you're not happy. But some of the time, some people are going to get exactly what they need at High and that protocol, and all they needed to know. They already knew about trauma. How? I don't know, but they already knew that and this. And they just needed to ask for their 100%. And bingo, it works. It absolutely works, by the way. If you ask enough people for your 100%, some people are going to say yes. But it doesn't mean that it's going to end well for you or for them, because neither of you necessarily know enough to navigate all the different terrain psychologically you're going to encounter on the way to attempting your 100%, and nor is there anyone going to say, "Up, you took a wrong turn here." You're just going to say, "I don't know, I must be fucked up," and feel the shame that our cult dumps on the individual for being absurd enough to expect people to learn from their parents how to have dramatically better relationships than their parents have, without any, effort whatsoever, and with very little statistical data. I mean, it would be nice if our government said, "We're going to do a 1,000-person study. Each of these New Age books that come out, we're going to take 1,000 people who want to study that, and we're going to see how much rape comes out of that group, how much self-awareness, how much income, how much hospitalization, all this, and we're going to say, this is a good protocol based on the statistics for this, and this is a good one for this, and this is a good one for this," because we're committed to best practice. And that's what we're going to do. But we can't be bothered, apparently. We don't love ourselves enough as a culture, as a country, as individuals, to gather the data that would allow us to analyze the patterns, that would allow us to attune to different demographics of people, to identify those. For example, I'm in the highly sensitive person demographic identified by Elaine Aron. 10 to 20% of the people are neurologically more sensitive. It can also come through a traumatic element that brings in more sensitivity. But this group has a different set of needs. It's just a different set of needs that the other 90% don't understand and generally shame. That's not taught at high either. So I'm left introducing the idea of ending agreements, the idea of a safe emotional conversation, the idea of highly sensitive, being highly sensitive, the history of our past relationships, because I want to make sure that, there's a good fit. And these women are saying, "What the fuck? I just feel very heady and complicated. I don't want anything to do. Let me just go find someone else who's happy to abuse me and just say, oh, that just happens sometime." But the statistics are not great. There are team members who have decades of lover relationship and abuse under their belts who are no closer off. The system is flawed because it's leaving out key bits. Now, when you have the chauvinism, one expression of it is nobody wants to not know something and be wrong, particularly the experts, right? "No, I knew that. No, I'm not going to ask for directions. No, I'll just drive around in circles endlessly because I don't want to feel the shame that I didn't know and be looked down on," in a culture that is too psychologically illiterate to understand that the smart person asks the question which is predicated on an openness that I don't know. And so, you have this dynamic in our culture where, whether it's men or women, they do not want to tell me, "I don't know what I'm doing here. I feel scared here," and this and that and the other, because they don't want to carry the shame. The facilitators don't want to say, "I don't know what I'm doing here." That's, into the rabbit hole with Peter Sandhill when I pointed out that he had blind spots in the psychedelic session. He assured me he didn't have blind spots, and he was so confident that he didn't want to hear what the blind spots were, making Peter perhaps the only person in history who doesn't have any blind spots, and who's so confident about that they don't even need to hear what they might have been to be confident they don't exist. Well, that's a staggering amount of humility for the vastness of the complex psyche in a data set of dismal failure. I mean, it may not be a failure of escalating sex 500%, but it sure is a failure when it comes to being able to love oneself, understand one's emotional boundaries, know how to build containers, respect the other person and oneself, know when someone's yes is abuse. You've got to know in an abuse dynamic when someone else's yes is abuse? Well, you don't know because you're traumatically illiterate. Well, why? There's nothing wrong with you. You're in a cult that will do anything it possibly can to avoid trauma and blame it on the victim. It's not going to be handed to you in a few nice hours of high school intelligence. This is traumatic symptoms, fight, flight, freeze. This is how age regression works. If you see someone who looks like a 6-year-old little girl who's saying yes and she's in a trance, that's someone in an abuse contract. And whatever she says she wants you to do, it's probably the exact opposite of what's good for you. But here's generally what does work. And you can educate her and bring books and carefully teach her that she's not a bad person. You're not having sex with her because she's bad or unlovable. You're not having sex with her because it's not good to have sex with regressed little girls in a traumatic abuse contract who don't know what that is and who are terrified of telling the truth because they don't want to be hit. You need to know that in a cult that produces people in that state and does nothing to educate them. It's not their fault. It's our fault as leaders that we don't throw this, this bullshitty curriculum in which algebra takes precedent over stuff like this, something you're never going to use in your whole life, takes precedent over stuff you need every single day of your life. And so I get thrown deeper into the abuse contract, and I don't want to fight with Peter because I'm dissociative. It's very, very vulnerable. I'm going into my feminine. What's being born is the shamed, crushed, terrified feminine that this cult has done a good job of stomping out and that needs to come in for a healthy sense of balance in the psyche. The more feminine I become, the more Peter Sandhill violates my feminine the way this culture violates the feminine, the way he violates his wife, the way he violates the feminine in himself. You think of the circle, for example. The circle gets its strength by its integrity within the individuals. It's just basic geometry. If you have a circle of people and everyone is loyal to the circle, you have a synergy that is much stronger than any individual, which is why it is intelligent to honor the circle, which is why it is pathologically insane for Peter Sandhill to escalate a sexual relationship with two times over a 10-year period, both abusively, both without attuning to his client, and not include his fellow facilitators. He's betraying the circle. That's what chauvinists do. It's all about me. And this is not about Peter Sandhill. Peter Sandhill is, on one level, bravely taking the hot seat for our culture. If you think I'm talking about Peter Sandhill and not us as a culture, that's just part of the chauvinism. Blame the individual. We have to look at the system that hired Peter, that protected Peter, the Sarah, that didn't challenge Peter 10 years ago or this time and come to me and say, Dane, I brought this man into high. You are part of our circle. I'm taking a stand for your safety and well-being. How has Peter impacted you? These are the deviations from best practices. You should never pay money for someone to implement poor practices. You have twice. I'm sorry I didn't do it 10 years ago when I heard that. I'm sorry I was scared of you rather than of my husband. And I'm sorry I didn't teach him well enough, and I recommended him to you. It's on me to honor the circle. We're not talking about a dysfunctional individual. We're talking about a dysfunctional system in which I, as a dysfunctional member of the system, allow certain abuses that I am not trained to recognize as abuse and stop, in which my therapist escalates profound psychological, spiritual, sexual abuse under the influence of psychedelics, in which the Human Awareness Institute asks me to sign a contract of secrecy, which is an abuse contract. It basically says, I, Dane, promise never to tell anyone what happened and never to sue high. Yours truly. And then high has the audacity to say this isn't a high issue. It's so not a high issue that we need to spend energy to cover it up. That's how not a high issue it is. You see how we're in the insanity terrain? This isn't a high issue. That's why we've got to, at high, make sure no one ever learns about it, because it has nothing to do with us. Do you ask people to sign contracts that say they will never tell anyone that there was a rock on a beach? I mean, that conceivably doesn't have anything to do with high. Are you asking people to sign non-disclosure agreements about everything that has nothing to do with high? Or only the stuff that is the central core of high's mission? High's contract to the public with the taxpayer that says we ask for a tax break so that we can do this work that puts the public first, not our egos, not our bank accounts, not how much money we can make, the public first. Well, when you sign that contract with the public, we will follow our mission, and when you get a supposedly independent board of directors to audit and make sure that you actually do what's good for the public, not what's good for the facilitator egos, then it's a fair contract. The taxpayer, takes a hit. The high doesn't pay for any roads or anything like that drive to its workshops and any of that. But we put the public interest first. Only we're not going to do it because it would cost us time and money to do so, and we might look bad. Doesn't it sound like Mom and Dad? It might make us look bad. We might actually have to love enough to become competent, and in our competency generate authentic love, and it's just, are we really worth that? Nah, we're not really worth it. We're busy, we're trying to make ends meet, we're doing this and that, the other. You're not worth it either. We're not going to give you a refund because, we work damn hard, putting in lots of hours fucking you up, and so why should we, if it doesn't work out, it's your fault. It's not the parents that are fucking up the children's lives, the poor parents fucked up by the children, and so there's no mistake. So always scapegoat the most vulnerable person in the scenario. So here's the descent down into the wound. And then, of course, the final stroke that really, made this a kind of, I am not standing for another high member going through this crap. Because you have to understand, if you understand abuse cycles, they don't stop. Peter's didn't stop. From 10 years, they escalated. So 10 years ago, Peter tried to do this, and I stopped it. And then in a suicidal state, after massive chronic failure within the community to meet needs for love and belonging, Peter succeeded in doing his original protocol, which amplified the damage 1,000-fold. Because there is nothing more feminine and vulnerable than the transcendent suggestibility of the psyche under high doses of psychedelics. And for a narcissist to come in there and maneuver that to protect his blind spots and avoid dealing with his impact as opposed to truly serving the client is diabolical. It is the last thing you want for your daughter. It's the last thing you want for your culture. It's the last thing you want for your brother and mother. So it shouldn't happen under High's auspices. Now, if High has the audacity to pretend that this isn't a High issue, if High facilitators in their own spare time want to charge people they have been recommended to by High to sexually abuse them, well, that's their own business and they're all at choice. You come back to that central blind spot. You are not at choice until you have an accurate map. If you know that going to Vegas and placing 100 bet puts you in the 2% probability of coming out with any money at all, let alone more, then you are at choice because you know the demographic and the statistic. Do I want to go and lose all my money? Here's the place to do it. Okay, you're at choice. Even then, it's a bit tricky, though, Because if you're carrying an abuse shame contract with your parents that say that you are evil, that you are fucked up, that you are unlovable and you deserve to be punished, and your parents are deities and never make any mistakes because they said so, and you've got tons of money, you may say, I don't deserve this money. I have to punish myself. Where can I punish myself? Oh, Vegas is good odds for that. Let me lose all my money there because I'm a bad person. Are you at choice? Not in a shame-based dynamic where if you confront the abuser, they have a fit and decimate a regressed child that never got to grow up in such a sociopathic environment. You're not at choice unless you learn about abuse dynamics and abuse contracts and how they hurt everyone involved. Then you're at choice. So there's two levels at being a choice: understanding the core beliefs that were shoved down and how they work and what their fallout is and what shame is and what abuse is and all that. If you throw off the dysfunctional beliefs and understand that you're a lovable, valuable person, and that most of the dysfunction in your life comes from poor protocols and guidance coming in your culture, and the scapegoating roles that you've been asked to play to make your parents feel more comfortable. Like my parents just couldn't stand feeling anything. So one of the things they would do is they'd rile up they learned patterns and they trained the children how to rile up in different ways. So whenever they were scared of feeling anything, they would start pushing the buttons and riling up my siblings. Now, I would babysit my siblings and they were great kids, just like I was. And I started analyzing why it was that my kids were so great with their oldest sibling, which is not normally in this culture an easy relationship. But they were 10 times better than they were with my parents. And I started watching how upset my parents got when they were not dysfunctioning and distracting them from their own shames and griefs and all of that. So I sat my parents down. Good New Age hippie parents sent us to Waldorf school. Hey, Dad, you want to know why your kids are so dysfunctional when you're around? Because you do this, this, and this, and you don't do this, and this is what I do when I babysit, and they're great kids. Do you want to know more? You superhuman parent who doesn't make any mistakes. No. He turned white and gave me a wide berth after that because I knew too much. And he tossed my siblings into massive amounts of dysfunction that's showing, impact past his death. He didn't want to know what was destroying his kids. He just wanted to be superhuman and superior. This is why I'm prepared for this high dynamic. I've seen the consequences. I've seen the statistics. I've spent 1,000 hours studying this stuff after it happened to me. Why is this happening to me? People tell me I'm smart. I run a business successfully for 25 years. I've never lied to a friend or lover. How did I get in this? More pain than I've felt in my entire life. I've got to find out. Because I trusted these people, which means that my operating system was flawed. I trusted them. So it's not just that they're untrustworthy. I'm untrustworthy because it's not a good decision-making protocol. It's like some part of me felt great walking over a cliff and then was surprised when I hit the ground. That means I don't have an accurate map of reality. And this is not an individual shame, secrecy type thing. This is a cultural epidemic of sustained, willful ignorance to protect secrets. And it leads the innocent, one after another, into trauma and confusion and pain that could easily have been avoided with a better map of reality. So the single most important thing that can happen about this is not punishment. Punishment in and of itself is, just a barbaric, low-level response to, projecting parent onto a deity or something. We're not. The point of all this is, do we, as individuals, as a community, as a country, love enough to want to develop competency. You don't if you're committed to willful ignorance. Well, when I brought the trauma books to the high facilitators, Jason Weston was the first to say, trauma isn't a high issue. We may traumatize people. We may be the ones who caused your PTSD as we systematically circled to exclude you and say this is not a high issue, and we will not give you an apology. We may have caused your PTSD, but PTSD is not what we want to teach here at High. Well, when you stop having traumatized abuse survivors on team and as participants, when you stop escalating sexuality in a group of people that are highly likely to be traumatized, when you differentiate and gather data about all of the damage in the wake of your protocols, and when you are instead teaching a trauma-literate culture, you may have the choice to just have a little caveat saying, we don't teach about trauma and PTSD, it's an important thing, make sure you've learned it, here are the books to read. But you don't even have that. You know how I learned about trauma? A stranger in a cafe. I was experiencing the full-blown symptoms of PTSD after being excluded. I was the only one not invited to listen and participate in the high facilitator meeting. My abuser was there, and it was very clear that the loyalty to my abuser and the abuse protocol was higher than the loyalty to my well-being. High has never spent a penny to facilitate my safety and well-being, which neared death on numerous occasions on multiple levels. They did spend a penny to sue me to make sure I couldn't let the public know when I bought a website when all my email accounts were frozen up so I couldn't tell anyone. This is a protocol of shame and secrecy. Sound familiar? This is the gift of the Harvey Weinstein women. These women, by the way, are being penalized as much as Edward Snowden, as much as Julian Assange for telling secrets. Some of them have $200,000 legal and therapy bills because that's what it takes to take care of themselves, to come forward. And we let these women pay the price for giving us the gift of sanity. The gift of sanity is to talk about this openly. This is what's going on. It's not these women's fault. At a deeper level, you could even say, well, it's not Peter's fault. If a whole group of his peers say he's up for the job and unilaterally recommend him and cover for him, and he's a culturally, traumatically chauvinistic man who doesn't know how to love his own feminine, how is that unpredictable? If the whole team is silent rather than confront their facilitators, team members, a few of them helping me, on condition that I don't ever tell who they were. We've got a secrecy epidemic. That's not love. That's not best practices. And so here we have the entry into the wound, and the question is, how do we deal with it? Well, this community and culture deals with it with taboo, secrecy, attacking whistleblowers. It's a very good, if you want to know how High behaves, watch how the U.S. government treated Julian Assange. Watch the priority that shutting Edward Snowden down got. Because it's the same dynamic. Shame, incompetence, secrecy, lies to the public. This is not in the benefit of the public. It's not in the benefit. It's not catching terrorists. It's not working. But we don't want anyone to know about it. So let's have non-disclosures, and let's hunt this man around the globe so he only finds refuge in Russia. I've followed it carefully because I understand the fractal nature of these patterns. Based on what my parents did, it would be predictable that the U.S. government would treat its citizens that tell the truth the way they treat Assange and Snowden. It's an exact fit. Well, you can find High in the midground. So you can look at the individual dynamic, the governmental dynamic, and then here's High in the midground. high will spend way more money to cover up the secrets than it will to honor its mission and be transparent. And it will break its contract with the law, with therapeutic ethics, with the public, with myself, with everyone involved with high, including themselves. And the question is, how do we get out of this? Here's how we get into it. We unconsciously copy the cultural fractal pattern of shame, secrecy, and incompetence, and blame it on the most vulnerable person, in this case, the therapeutic patient. So I have a relationship here, a growing student on a journey, trying to learn how to live a more ethical life. I have a relationship with a public nonprofit, my therapist taking money to teach and lead, respect for the generosity of the team, wanting to serve, the innocence and trust of the new seeker. High's put 40,000 people through this, and one of the sad things in an understanding where we know that gathering data is one of the best ways to test efficacy in anything. And one of the things that we criticize Big Pharma for is they manipulate the data, they hide the negative surveys. You know, the OxyContin company made billions addicting Americans to opioids by suppressing and hiding, and they shamed the addicts. They asked the addicts to call an 800 number, and then when they called, they tried to convince the addicts to OxyContin that it was their fault so that they wouldn't press litigation, and that was the emphasis of their script. So when you have that kind of a dynamic, how do you respond? There's the relationship with the culture that we want to have, the relationship and with the medicine needed for a cult of secrecy, shame, and illiteracy in so many areas with the wound. How does an individual relate to this in this dynamic? Well, there's a couple of very important things on this path. And remember the ethical path, if you look at the geometry of the situation, the first thing to understand is there's two parts of every human being, there's two parts of every culture. You have the wound, and you have the healthy, integrated, or becoming part. You have the authentic self, and you have the adaptive pain management strategy. Our culture creates massive amounts of pain. And most of us are addicts to adrenaline, to shame, to fear, to anxiety, to sleep deprivation, to keeping busy, frantically doing these jobs we hate, to make more money, to spend more money. We are addicts to manage the pain of a dysfunctional system. The addicts are necessary for short-term survival to buy time to change the system. When addiction becomes the method to protect the system, I'm not going to protest a faulty system. I'm instead going to let it keep hurting me, and I'm going to keep drugging myself up to higher and higher levels because I'm loyal to the abuser. I'm loyal to the negative ego. I'm loyal to the government. I'm loyal to my cult. I'm loyal to my abusers. And I'm loyal to the protocol of secrecy and shame. So I've got only one option. I can give the pain on to other people, pass it on. That's when we replicate the virus of abuse. Always feels better for a little bit. Or we can deal with we can addict, just numb, alcohol, cigarettes, all that, eating too much. Have an obesity epidemic, let's just rename fat as beautiful. Simple. Let's hide it. Let's go insane rather than deal with the addiction dynamic. People who are not in pain, chronic, unmanageable pain, don't become addicts. We've even gone crazy in there. One of the leading Canadian researchers in the world, Gabor Mate, did some alternative studies to help point out that without underlying trauma and pain, it is not the biology's nature to addict. And you can see that in rats. because they typically do the rat addict studies with sociopathic doctors with Klieg lights, little wire cages, that traumatize the shit out of these rats and then give them the choice to addict on cocaine, and they become addicts. But what Gabor Mate did was said, well, let's actually see if a healthy rat wants to addict. Is it really the substance that's so toxic, or is it the environment that's so toxic? So when you put the same rats in a nice forest setting with lovely family mates, no sociopathic doctors deciding who they're going to kill that day and, looking and having bright lights, and you give the rats the option of eating cocaine or living a healthy lifestyle and eating nourishing food, they sometimes touch the cocaine, but they don't become addicted. It is a sociopathic environment where the only way out are pain management substances. And of course, sex is a massive addiction. When you are in chronic levels of pain and you can produce endorphins in your body that are 400 times more powerful than morphine by falling in love, there is an incredible rush and desire to keep the new relationship energy flowing to manage pain. But there's a big distinction in healthy addiction and pain management. For example, for the first time in my life, partly around some of this trauma, I broke a major bone. I broke the scapegoating bone. I broke the radial head off the elbow. My arm's dangling. I can't move it. I don't have full motion back. I may not ever get that. But for 4 days after the operation, I needed massive amounts of pain. I couldn't think. I couldn't manage, etc. As a very short duration to allow an operation that will help the long-term well-being of the body. Addiction, pain management is good. As soon as you become using pain management to allow you to tolerate a chronic chosen lifestyle, meaning I'm going to live in a fucked up cult and live a fucked up lifestyle that fills me with pain, shame, inadequacy, and anxiety, and I'm going to keep doing that. I'm just going to up my endorphins. I'm going to up my chemicals. I'm going to do this so that I can tolerate the pain. Now we're enabling an abuse culture. We're not transforming it. The purpose of pain is a reminder, ding, 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 ding. This isn't how therapy is supposed to be. Ding, 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 ding. This isn't how nonprofits are supposed to behave. Ding, 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 ding. This is not how support groups are supposed to respond. When I went to Laura Willing in the East Bay and said, I've been sexually abused by Peter Sandhill under the influence of psychedelics and I need help. And the first thing that Laura did after the break was say that how upset she was that I had taken up time and caught her off guard and this and that and the other. And I left that support group understanding that how would Laura Willing, in a dysfunctional training protocol that ignores and willfully shuts out trauma, how would she possibly know how to treat a sexual abuse survivor? And then you could say, well, it's not support groups' jobs to support people of sexual abuse, even though we spit out sexual abuse all the time in our culture. Well, it kind of has to be if facilitators are going to be sexually abusing their clients. Because that's a big fuck you to the whole group to say, look, it's not a high issue to prevent sexual abuse by our facilitators. It's not a high issue to respond or support sexual abuse survivors, but it is a high issue to ask them to sign non-disclosures and discourage them, as in the case of another sexual abuse survivor after all this, who was promised that this had never happened before, lie, by Janet Dale, promised, and then asked not to withdraw her police report because that would be bad for High. When the name of High becomes more important than the function of High to educate and help the public, you have an abuse organization, not a healing nonprofit. Well, what are we going to do about it? And the reason I think this is important to look at as a fractal thing is I think we waste too much time on Washington. Oh, my goodness, what have they done now? Well, if the entire community, as I wrote to the entire community and the entire board of directors and the entire facilitator body and the entire team does not want to touch this issue of systemic sexual abuse that is predictable, with any competent trauma survivor or trauma therapist on the board would say this and this and this is going to lead to this and here's how we need to handle it, but let's just not have any on the board, right? No sexual abuse trauma therapists on the board. No ethical nonprofit leaders on the board. No anyone on the board except cronies of the facilitators who have not received trauma and sexual abuse training. Well, of course, you're not going to get ethics out of that. That is a system of willful incompetence. So how does an individual respond? And the ethical path, by the way, and I've outlined that in much more detail, strengthens the circle. So the delusion in the schizophrenic mind is that this story is the enemy of high. This is the delusion of the paranoid schizophrenic mind. This story is the best thing for the participant, for the team, for the therapist, for the nonprofit, for medicine, for the culture, and our possible culture. This story is the best thing that could possibly happen to high. Because the events have happened and have happened repeatedly. Now, no, those events, therapists abusing participants, should not be happening. That is not in the interest of high. But knowing about it is the best thing for Peter Sandhill, for Sarah Sandhill, for the facilitators, because the way chronic abuse cultures continue is by sustained abuse dynamics that always have a secrecy clause. All abuse that is chronic has an umbrella of willful ignorance and secrecy. The Harvey Weinstein women, some of them, were not even allowed a copy of the non-disclosure agreement that they signed. Meaning, the terms of the non-disclosure contract said that because we're so committed that no one knows that you signed a non-disclosure, because if they knew that you signed a non-disclosure agreement, then they would know there was something not to disclose. And we're so committed to the public being in the dark around the welfare of young women working with powerful men that the Disney Corporation is going to shepherd, around Harvey and set up this thing where the women have to be escorted by the attorneys of their abuser in to look at their own non-disclosure contract, because otherwise someone might see the non-disclosure contract saying you promise not to say about this abuse, and then it might get out, and then it would make the family Disney, not look very good, and this would be terrible. And, and obviously Jason Weston isn't that sophisticated. And that would be the absolute worst thing that could come out of this, was that the high facilitators still don't teach trauma, still don't apologize, still don't make reparations, still don't declare what's going on, still don't learn about their clients before shoving them into tumultuous traumatic terrain, still blame their clients, still escalate romantic relationships under under a therapeutic container, but they're better at hiding it. You see, Peter Sandhill was completely innocent. This is why it's not. He believed his own bullshit, in other words. I recorded the whole event because I thought, what if I get high and I can't remember my therapy? So I said, Peter, I'm going to record the whole thing. He said, great, good idea. Which tells you that he comes in completely blind, expecting it to go great. And he compounds his abuse later by denying some of the things he said. And then my own therapist, Ann Watts, doesn't believe me because I wasn't invited to the meeting. So Peter was allowed to say whatever he wanted to kind of get him to keep his job. And what better protocol could you have? How would you like it if when your teenage daughter communicates that your therapist has abused them, that a bunch of the therapist friends get together to decide what's going to happen, and your daughter is not invited when she asked to tell her story. The only one not invited is the one that needs to be at the center. That's a pattern that leads to pain. Pain is a virus. If you use a faulty protocol that causes pain in your client, you will cause pain in your business. So this is a great thing that it's coming to light. It's a great thing for the women, for our country, that the Harvey Weinstein issue came to light. No, it's not a great thing that people covered up Harvey for 20 years. That's not a great thing. And Harvey Weinstein didn't magically clear up without any apologies and stuff either, right? So, this is not going to clear up, just to give you a little bit of psychological context. The odds of this stuff just magically, evaporating and never happening again is about 5%. That's the odds. Now, if this goes to court, and this is one of the interesting things, because it occurred to me in a very sad and painful way as this was going on. The pattern that the facilitators seemed to be responding to was fear of a court case. I mean, no idiot says that it's not a high issue, that when they've promised you they're committed to a world where everyone wins, that this isn't a high issue, that you're in PTSD because you trusted one of our facilitators. Only a complete shit-headed moron can pull that off. But if you're, if you're afraid of a court case and your attorney says, don't admit anything, this will ruin you. You of course it's an issue, but you're going to tell your victim that it's not an issue to satisfy your attorney. Now this gets into the interesting thing. Is high in the mission statement of satisfying attorneys at the expense of their own ethics and mission? Or are they in the business of serving the public and giving them a clear map of what is and isn't abused? If everyone abused at high goes out with less of a clear picture of what abuse is and isn't than when they went in, they're violating their mission. Screw the attorney. See, high shouldn't exist as a business. Jason sees it more as a business. We're here to make money and this and that. Brought in a lot of the business focus. If high makes money doing the exact opposite of its mission, it should go bankrupt. It should be shut down. And so the tragedy of this, and it's generally the way fear works. You're terrified of something happening, so you don't think rationally. You're attached to the fear. In this case, the fear of high's image and da-da-da, whatever. And so you behave stupidly. When you behave stupidly, the legitimacy of your enterprise weakens. You don't become more legitimate by tormenting the people you've abused. But in a fear and ignorance dynamic where the facilitators don't know what PTSD, they don't know how they're shaming people, they don't want to hear because they're blocking dialogue because that's might make them culpable. And so they're pretending that they kind of dig a very interesting grave. I've never taken anyone to court in 25 years. I've never needed to. No one's ever taken me to court in 25 years as a contractor. That's somewhat unusual. I'm not a litigious person. The last thing on my mind was court. But understanding that another woman has been sexually abused and was lied to. And the pattern of fear is that it seems to me that the facilitators are loyal to their fear of being sued to an extent that they are willing to escalate their own abuse to decrease their perceived legal risk. What they don't understand is the stupidity. When you have a 10-hour recording of illegal psychedelic drugs being pushed and escalated by a facilitator, recommended by all of high, and then you have a legal contract by the head of that organizing saying, don't tell anyone and don't sue us, and this isn't a high issue, and you do not show a single penny of high offering to pay, healthy licensed trauma repair, and no refund for the event. Like even after Peter Sandhill, who was gracious enough to apologize under duress, admittedly, it weakens it, but gracious enough to apologize. He's like, yes, I abused you here. Yes, I did this. I'm sorry for this. I'm sorry for this. I'm so sorry. Bye, Peter. And you wonder how much you have to handhold them. Okay, Peter, at Best Buy and at Safeway, when they sell me poisonous food or broken laptops, they give a refund, or a better product. Do you need to be told that as well? I mean, how much do you have to hold your therapist before they figure out what their job is supposed to be? And is that a burden we want to fall on the next abuse survivor who Peter Sandhill has a sexual interest in? So the paradox that's sad and funny at the same time is if High continues to behave like a frightened, shame-based child, because that's what they created in me. I'm the wound of the frightened, shame-based child, terrified, scared shitless, lost, lonely, hurt, sad, broken-hearted. I fell in love with this guy, then he was scared of his own incompetence, and he began treating me crueler than most any lover I've met, ignoring emails, not doing this, insisting on charging for every penny, suggesting I marry someone that was, we'll go into that, another time. My loyalty is first and foremost to the innocence and trust by the student paying for help. To the culture we can co-create if we give a damn and love enough to be competent, which means caring enough to learn. I mean, I've studied this for 1,000 hours because this is important. I don't want this happening to your 15-year-old son brought up in the same culture. And it will, statistically, if we don't do something about it. So loyalty to the patient, to the culture. Now, this is what is best for the client is best for High. Make no mistake. What is best for the client is best for High, is best for the therapist, is best for the team, is best for the culture, and is medicine for the culture's wound, and is best for me. There is no enemy. The enemies and the kind of illusion of conflict come into play when you have a fear, shame-based reaction on the part of the egos in the facilitators that is echoed by an incompetent board that doesn't have the training and just wants to make the facilitators happy. And a team that doesn't want to fight with the facilitators, because I've heard endless dynamics about that, where it's, they said this and they said this, but then they did this, and they don't want to, who wants to volunteer to fight with your facilitators? So the team doesn't want to, and so that's where the caveat comes in. If a team member helps me, don't tell the facilitators who I was. Well, that's speaking worlds about the amount of trust. When the healthy people doing the right thing have to hide that they're doing the right thing from the dysfunctional parents who are more committed to the secrecy while calling this the room of love, you've got the whole parental dynamic right there. Something that Ann Watts was gracious enough to, point out, but not to respond and become a healthy advocate and say, look, this is coming out. You're my number one priority. I'll do whatever is necessary to put your well-being first. You're my client. And it's not okay that I, as your therapist, encouraged you to keep this secret. I apologize. And you're going to get the support you need, whatever it takes. If High goes down because it's too incompetent, fine. We don't need another corrupt institution befuddling sexual abuse with love. What we need are adults who know the difference between sexual abuse and competent therapy, and who will put the interest of the clients first always, and who will care enough to attune. One of the most fascinating narratives in this whole thing is this process, that throughout all of this, not one facilitator ever asked, how can we help? What do you need? How is this feeling and working for you? How can we adjust and moderate? Every single one on the high team told me how I could make it easier for them. They told me what they needed and wanted. They reluctantly or eased into giving me some of the things I started demanding in more and more shrill, levels. But they didn't attune. And so what could have been ended and dissipated gracefully in a few hours has become the threat that they feared. Not because this information threatens the organization, but because the behavior that this information reveals is a schizophrenic paranoid behavior that is the essence of the abuse shame-based cult that we go to schools to learn to transcend, and which cannot be taught by people who don't know it. So I also would like to say that the more I descended into the wound, the more I descended into my regressed child and my angry adolescent. And one of the things that I asked Jason for in one of my last emails to him, which he ignored, was the need for objectivity. Shame-based therapists, afraid for their organization and their egos and stuff being damaged, and their regressed, sexually abused, traumatized patient should not be navigating what happens with high from this point forward. That is patently absurd. Now, the team and the board of directors have pushed away their responsibility and were not chosen for their competency in the first place. That leaves the courts, that's almost definitely the end of high. I mean, is Peter gonna sit there saying, that this wasn't his voice, sexually abusing a patient and telling him to take more drugs when he said no and stuff? Is Peter going to claim that? What on earth? You think the judge is going to believe that this was out of love and support? The jury? I mean, give me a break. You can be crazy, but you have to be pretty fucked up to be that crazy. So that's pretty much, the end of high. That's very sad, frankly, because this was so easy to avoid. There was, 100 different doorways every step of the way saying, how about this easy way? How about you stop charging me? How about you apologize? How about you hold me and listen to what I have to say? How about you bring in a mediator? How about you do this? How about you apologize publicly? Anything. And it's incredibly sad because we grieve for the stupidity and cruelty of these facilitators. We're not talking about them. We're talking about our own painful egos when we get caught in our own secrets and things. We're talking about our country. You expect Trump to do a better job than the high facilitators? Of course not. It's the same fractal pattern. Trump's not pretending to be a loving teacher of relationship. He's just saying, I'm a guy that goes around getting what I want and punishing people I don't. Doesn't give it to me. It's right in my book. But if we can't deal with therapists in a competent way, why on earth do we think we should deserve a president that's better than our nonprofits? There's complete apathy in the circle around this. Now, of course, the more media attention I bring, and with, this, that, the other, high will be a nice scapegoat. We like scapegoating things. But that doesn't really transcend the pattern. It is very, very important, however, that the sexual abuse survivors in high's wake know the difference between what was and was not abuse, what was and was not good therapy. Did they get it or not? And get an apology so they are not carrying the shame of incompetent therapists and paying money to believe that they're fucked up. They did what they thought they should do. It didn't work out, and they're unlovable. That's the worst thing. That's what parents do all the time. It's tremendously destructive if that gets weighed in by a professional. That's the bottom line, by the way. Now, there are good parts. There are good parts in you and me. There's good parts in the government. There's good parts in our culture. There's good parts in these facilitators. Can those good parts find any basis to do the right thing? Do they have to be on the edge of bankruptcy? What is it? There is a massive crisis that this reveals. This is not an isolated, wow, we would never do this except with Dane. Of course we'd ask Dane to sign an abuse contract promising never to tell his wife about his own sexual abuse, but we wouldn't expect anyone else to do that. Of course we would apologize to but no, we wouldn't apologize. What's the message? What's worse, saying we're going to gang up on a suicidal person who's identified themselves as highly sensitive with Asperger's, or are we going to gang up on everyone else? What's the message? Where's the coherent pattern here? And it emerges with what is best for the patient. Now, my therapists and my nonprofit don't know what's best to repair trauma. So I did the research to find out. And I've applied a lot of it at great expense to help repair my own life. Now this is a strong circle. There's nothing stronger than advocating for best practices for all, because everyone benefits. A team member wrote to me and said she had canceled and just disappeared out of high after developing sexual abuse and PTSD. She's still doing therapy for it. It's not good for the team to have a trauma-illiterate power base of facilitators, a trauma-illiterate board. It's in everyone's interest that there are systemic changes. We're not talking about fundamentally evil people. We're talking about uneducated people. We're talking about shame-based people. We're talking about willfully ignorant people. We're talking about our culture. So, what do you do when you're too ignorant to know that you're ignorant? Well, that also takes study and care. And so, this is a very light dose of something that I've spent thousands of hours with, because I've never experienced more pain in my entire life. And because it seems unethical for me to disappear into silence and shame and betray the nonprofit's mission, betray Peter Sandhill by letting him stay pampered by his cronies rather than face his impact. That's a betrayal to the goodness in him. We've all got an addictive side that will get away with stuff, but we don't appreciate coming to the end of our life and seeing that we have fucked up big time and our friends didn't care enough about us to stop it. The team needs leaders that are worth leading by being human enough to admit when they fuck up. It's human. We make mistakes all the time. Make it public. Here's where we're fucked up here. Here's where we fucked up here. Here's what we're going to do about it. What we would like your input. One of the startling sadnesses in a scientific paradigm that seems to work is I've never received a survey at any time in my high workshops that have asked the pertinent questions that any school should be asking. 1, how many times have you been raped at high? How many times have you raped someone at high? How many times have you asked permission and gotten yes and yes, and then it turned out terribly? How many times have you been emotionally traumatized? Do you know what trauma is? Are you an incest survivor? Did this help your sexual abuse? How much pain are you in? what's your success ratio using high protocols versus something else? There is no interest in understanding the efficacy of the basic protocol. And I did not enter what is now a successful marriage until I understood that High's protocol was fundamentally flawed, and I reversed it. I did the exact opposite. For example, when I met my wife, I did not ask what my 100% was. I asked myself how I could help this person become the most amazing being that she could possibly become. Who would I have to be, one, and was I willing to be that? And as a result, I'm with one of the most amazing beings on the planet. Her life skills have shot up thousands of percent. Her well-being has shot up hundreds of percent. I'm with a very happy, competent person because I made it my business to serve. Feels great. It's the first time I've done that. I was asking, what's my 100%? And then complaining when nobody was giving it. Didn't work. So just do the opposite of, what you learn at High and see if that works. In this case, it worked brilliantly. And so there is a framework of response that I feel I owe or want to invest in the culture I want to create. And I want to be clear, I am not attached to anyone being or not being a High facilitator. I'm not attached to anyone being on the board or not. I'm not attached if High continues or not. What I'm attached to is that anyone in the role of a nonprofit and in a leadership role in the most vulnerable areas of the psyche has the ethics, the training, and the support to, one, not fuck up and damage severely the life of their client, and two, to have high data-based odds of success, which means following up and seeing, what is your track record? This track record of this facilitator. For example, I got much better help from Ann Watts than I ever did from Peter. Ann Watts never tried to come on to me. Was that it? She also listened more. She was more nuanced, more patient, listened more, and the only crappy thing that Ann Watts ever advised me was when I was saying we should come forward and tell the community what's going on, the ethical responsibility. Ann said, no, it'd be better for you and Peter if this was hushed up. And that was a lie. Half the pain and shame in sexual abuse cases comes from covering up the abuse to protect the abuser. Because the message is the abuser's secret is more valuable than the community's right to know. How is the High community at choice without data? I mean, a drug company may say, you're at choice to take our drugs, and here are all the wonderful things about our drugs. But we're not going to mention that 20% of the people die, because that would make us look bad, and you might not buy our drugs. So we're going to withhold that information, but you have the right to choose. You don't have the right to choose unless you have all the information. So I'm attached to complete transparency, which puts me in opposition with the shame and fear of the egos of the facilitators. It doesn't put me in opposition with the interest of the client. You see, if the facilitators cannot find it within themselves to put their clients first, even after years of opportunity, they must resign for their own sanity, for their own health and well-being. When you know you are fucking people's lives up based on data that is being rammed down your throat because you won't absorb it, you are hurting your psyche to hurt other people to do a job you are unwilling to do competently. Now, I am willing to be on any 10, 12-person board of ethical therapists, sexual, trauma therapists, nonprofit advocacies, and debate what are the very best protocols based on what surveys and studies around any of this terrain and accept the findings. I suggested to Jason Weston that I hire 3 independent experts, and I will abide by whatever they find. That's, of course, conveniently denied, which makes a lawsuit almost inevitable, because who else is there to turn to? If even the independent experts are the enemy to facilitator shame and fear-based egos, then they're forced into the courts, because I'm not willing to let the next sexual abuse victim be on my conscience because I stayed silent, like most sexual abuse survivors do in this culture, for 11 years. So I'm ahead of the curve, right? 11 years is how much time it takes the average person to come forward, and many of them regret it because the incompetency of our culture to deal with that information is often thrust in a scapegoating manner on the person, which is why we have a culture of shame, secrecy, and chronic intergenerational abuse cycles. If you want that, do nothing. It's already happening. If you want to take a little bit of leadership, be a little bit of an adult, be a little bit more responsible, own up, get off your fucking butt, and stop complaining about Washington and do something about the Washington here. This is Washington right here. Peter Sandhill and Sarah's house, the facilitator body, and their commitment to secrecy and asking their victims to carry their shame and their secrets so that others don't have the right to know. They sued me to shut down a website letting the public know. They lost, of course, spending nonprofit money wasted rather than doing something about it. Well, this hurt like hell. This has devastated my life for 4 years, financially, health, emotionally, relationally. It's been very difficult. And it has hurt people around me. That's the nature of disease. It ripples out if it's not healed and contained. It should be every single person's top priority that the next person does not experience that. And there are very specific guidelines about how to do that. 1 is complete transparency. 2 is apology. 3 is the offenders carry the cost of the abuse. I mean, if the precedent at high is, oops, we abused you, but you don't get a refund, as opposed to, we are so sorry, this person's going to be trained, everyone's going to understand the issues, the public's going to have a right to choose with the information, and we're going to see that you come out of this okay. How can we help? What do you need? We're at your back. As opposed to an abuse contract saying, don't tell anyone, and this isn't anything to do with high. Well, they're night and day. And we need to expect the best from a school that's labeling love and healthy relationships and commitment to win-win. That's where we turn to learn. And I'm learning how to have a marriage by doing the opposite. How can I serve you 100% as opposed to what's my 100%? It works great. It's wonderful being around a happy, growing person who adores you because you're really loving in that sense of helping that hierarchy of human needs. Learned a lot. Now, this is just a taster. And so around this, there are a series of videos that are part, if you want to do your part to be competent, to be responsible, to be safe, to grow, to become an adult, because adults protect the innocent. There's a real problem when people ask for help and don't get it. When an abusive therapist in a community of love and healthy relationship doesn't do their job, breaks their high agreements and all that. So Just briefly, some of the terrain that is around this issue that I want to encourage you to explore. Shame, secrets, and defenses. There's a lot, that's a whole kind of network, and this is obviously too long to go into all at one time. So shame, secrets, and abuses. Diagnosing, understanding, and prescription. That's how all patterns change. You diagnose, you say, this is the pattern that's happening that's causing pain. And we call that a disease. This is what we think will make it better. And then you get feedback. Is it working? Which means you got to gather data before and after. I've done that in the whole website where I've analyzed, what's all the various things that went wrong that didn't seem quite often, and so I have a whole diagnosis page in one of the High websites that I built. By the way, as soon as the High facilitators sued me to shut down one website, I bought 5 more domains all about High, because you can't reward people for a protocol of secrecy and shame when this culture is trying to wake up around sexual abuse with the Me Too movement. High needs to be leading this battle and advocating for people like me, not shutting them down to protect its own inadequacies. A technology of 10x relationships. I got very interested in 10x thinking, and so one of the projects I've done as part of this, there's a whole scattered kind of rift of different projects that I've done, starting a nonprofit, various things. So a technology of 10x relationships is part of filling in the gaps that just come from your choice, have a safe sex conversation, ask for permission, and see what happens. What are the goals? What are my goals with this? I have goals. What are they? So, video about that. The fractal nature of reality. I've touched on that, but I go into that in more detail. Understanding the ethical path to win-win. Ethics is one of the if you have a mission statement that says we're committed to the whole world winning, then what you're looking at is a circle, and what you're looking at in mathematical terms is that every behavior at each point in the circle strengthens the entire circle. So you think of this as a thin bit of aluminum here. And a thin bit of aluminum, you take some bashes, etc., it's going to break. Now, if you want to make a very strong structure with a lot of integrity, you want to put little beads of string or wire back and forth, and the more things that you do that strengthen every other person in the circle, the stronger your circle is. And the more things you do to betray, lie, have secrets, violate, blame, all this kind of stuff, do the thing that hurts. When Peter tells me a secret he's keeping with his wife and blocks his own ego from Sarah's greater intelligence, she's more cautious than Peter, so that's why he didn't tell her, right? Because if he'd said, I'm going to, that guy that you were all upset with, that I wanted to have sex with and blah, 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 10 years ago, well, I'm going to go do a psychedelic session in his house with MDMA and this and that for 10 hours, and we'll see what happens. What do you think, Sarah? Well, of course she's going to say, Peter, what are you doing? You're damaging High. You're breaking the law. Like, talk to the facilitator. Do this. Well, he didn't want to do that, right? So he just cut Sarah out. He broke his tie with Sarah, which weakens the circle. But he also broke his tie with his team. How many team members would say, good on you, Peter. Keep up the work. Hold us to our agreements, and then betray all the agreements you ask and tell us are so important. He fucks over the team. He fucks over the facilitator. And he fucks over himself, and he fucks over me. He's just decimated every one of his loyalties to the circle because he knew best. And he had this crazy thing from Linda Sassara, his new energy teacher. He said, this is flowing in beautifully into my schedule. That's how I know this was meant to happen. It's not meant to happen because I talked with my wife and I'm keeping my agreements and all this. It's flowing into my schedule. And so he's teaching me incompetence. He's teaching me that if I want to sexually abuse someone, all I have to do is see if it flows into my schedule, and it was meant to be. And that doesn't work. If it doesn't work, it damages the entire circle. When you sever, when the facilitators damage their relationship with me by denying that this is a high issue and denying help because it's not a high issue, when they take that position, when they refuse to apologize, they are damaging the law. They're making it harder and harder for a jury to see their case. You mean to say that you listened to this 45-minute recording from your client explaining 10 years of abuse, correct? Okay. He asked to see you and to be heard, right? Okay. And you all met behind his back and refused to hear him, and then you asked him to sign this contract. And you're a public nonprofit. Now, this is the document he was asked to sign, right? Do you have a copy of his signature? No, he didn't sign it, because even in a regressed, traumatized state, he understood that this was an abuse contract. The question is, why didn't the head of high? Why was the head of high embodying our cult shame, secrecy, abuse ethics? Why? And why should we give you a tax break to continue this bullshit when you cover it up and the next person may not have a recording? We should shut you down. You see, this information is not the enemy of high. High's behavior is the enemy of every single person on the circle, most notably every single facilitator. I am not the enemy. The trauma therapist who was abused after me is not the enemy. The team member who went silent and disappeared and is still doing therapy is not the enemy. The other people in the woodworks are not the enemy. Faulty beliefs and practices are the enemy. Incompetence, not loving enough to become competent, that's the enemy. Which is why this is the single best thing that could possibly come to High's door. The invitation to grow up and transcend, or fold up and stop the abuse cycle. Either way, it's a win for the public. So we have understanding the ethical path to win-win. I've gone into that to great detail because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing anything. I also want, the purpose, before your choice, you need to have a map that you believe. Now, we teach people not to think in schools and to just copy and do the various dogmas and stuff like that. So it's pretty hard for some of us to think. And it's no fun to sit down and listen to an 8-hour recording on the ethics of Peter to Sarah in here and the ethics of Peter to... But if you are committed to turning an abusive organization into an ethical leader organization that can take us where we want to go in the culture and could raise people that might actually be decent presidents rather than dysfunctional versions of high facilitators, is it worth 8 hours of your time? If not, you don't love enough to be competent. So stop calling it love and call it going with the flow and accepting our cult statistics. 78% of Americans are lonely and rising. 25% of Americans are depressed. Just go with that flow and see where it goes. Now, we also have the crisis of initiation. I never learned to be an adult. Strangely, in the midst of pain and dysfunction and all of that, and deciding to care for another human being, I learned a little bit about being an adult. But this is a really critical thing. We are surrounded by children in grown-up bodies who don't know what an adult is, and we do not know how to initiate them. Getting drunk and smoking and stealing a car is not becoming an adult. It's just a dysfunctional adolescent grasping for something. The law of empathy is a very, very deep and profound law that pervades throughout this entire thing, and I strongly encourage you to understand that law because it highlights the deficit in container building in High's protocol. The better system for power and transparency. A lot of things are technological. The United States has a pretty decent constitution, but that hasn't stopped the CIA and various agencies from violating it right and left. But it's a pretty decent system that needs an upgrade in the digital age. The Human Awareness Institute also, and power structures like it, need an upgrade that guarantee voice. When the facilitators can have a backdoor meeting, violate the agreement between the lists and the heartbeat and the participant. Now, if you read the agreement of the heartbeat and list agreements, you will never see a very important clause that's the hidden clause in the agreement. If you are sexually abused by a facilitator, and we have advised you to stay silent about it, and you refuse to stay silent about it, we may, at our discretion, knock you off the list to protect our reputation. Now, you will not find that actual clause on the list because everyone would say this is an abuse culture and fuck you for trying to pull the wool over us and call this love. But it is a clause, as evidenced where after announcing to the facilitators that I would not be silent, both Heartbeat and NorCal Announce went dead without warning for the first time in 10 years. So just know if your sister or anyone else gets abused by a high facilitator, the protection of the abuser is paramount. And your right to receive support in the community will be weakened by the facilitator body, and the independent, quote-unquote, board of directors will do nothing about it. That's a case for the law. Now, it's incredibly irritating to go through our court and legal system over this, and it's incredibly sensitive and painful, and of course, it's taken a lot of time to get pieces of my life back together. I will be mad as hell if it takes dragging the facilitators to the court steps before they cry uncle and say, oh, okay, we'll tell the public what happened, we'll appoint a trauma therapist on the board, we'll write some ethics down, fine, we'll give you a refund. Because no, it's a message of shame and belittlement. It's belittling High's mission. It's saying we don't stand for shit. We don't even know what our business is. And we'll do as little as possible, kicking and screaming like little babies each step of the way, demanding that our client knows our jobs better than we are. At that point, I think they're better just to be shut down. But I will be incredibly appreciative if any leadership body within the team, the community who wants to salvage the good parts of High, and not just see the facilitators thrown in jail, will step forward and be a fucking adult. Hire a group of competent people to review this material, follow their guidance, become a leader, get rid of the people who don't want to abide by best practices, and put in technology that takes away the power of the government to shut the public down when they reveal their secrets. The government is suing to get Edward Snowden's royalty from his new book. It's a beautiful book, by the way. If we could only have more people like Edward Snowden who care about the Constitution, we'd have a better country. If we could only have a president who cared about the Constitution, we'd have a better country. But our country has spent far more money harassing whistleblowers and, extracting political asylum out of Peru by digging up dirt on the new president than it has in reforming the ethics of this government. And the question that's a really interesting question is, can what's good in the high facilitators transcend this shit? Meaning, it's very unlikely that Washington is going to change. And I think one of the reasons is, why should we expect Washington to be better than High? I don't. I expect High to be better than Washington. Now, President Trump is not an evil person. He's a person who's been heavily rewarded for expediency by people who let him get away with it, and so he's an expedient president. Now, a better system of power and transparency. I went into a whole 10x model of what high could look like with ethical leadership, to actually earn its stars, so to speak, and ensure that whistleblowing within the high community is not punished by silence and shame, but is honored and responded to with best practices that continue to evolve. So I strongly encourage that if you care enough to move towards competency. Understanding chauvinism is a very deep topic. I've spent about 20 hours making videos on that because it's such a big deal. It's the biggest rot in our culture. And it's wonderful. The Me Too movement is a part of unsettling this bureaucracy of it's pseudoscience crap compared to the real science of balance. It's just as dumb when you get into the balance of a wheel. I mean, do you want one half of the wheel to be twice as heavy as the other so that it takes twice as much energy to move? That's what our culture is. It is very difficult to navigate in our culture emotionally because everyone's competing to be masculine, because masculine is the only thing that's valued in men and in women. If you want to look at, I listen to my clients talk about their daughters. The only clients who brag about their daughters to me are clients who brag about the masculine traits of their daughters. That's what a daughter has to become in this cult in order to be bragged about. Boy, she has 500 guys working under her, and she's a hard ass and a badass, and it's just so fucked up. Why can't a man or a woman be feminine and treated with honor when we could use a tremendous we all would be blessed by a 500% increase in warm, empathic, feminine energy, be they men or women. It's the lucky person who gets to be in that state. And that's, the positive parts of high is that side. It's, when you have an organization that's sick, you have to diagnose the disease, or the disease consumes the organization. And that's the question. But you can't have an organization that's contagious, disseminating faulty memes. So understanding the ethical path to win-win, the goals. So this is kind of the links around this video that are designed to help anyone who loves enough to care and cares enough to understand and understand enough to attune, to be competent. I stand in the position of high's wound. And I will assume that the way that I am treated or not treated is exactly how everyone who is abused within high's power structure will be treated and not treated. And if that diverges from best practice, and more importantly, if it shows up in a pattern of systemic abuse, that's not a safe structure to leave standing. And we create our culture and reality by causing it, but also by allowing it, by willful ignorance and passivity. We've got too much of it. And so I'm not going to stand around and pretend I'm going to get a great country by hiding sexual abuse in local nonprofits. And I encourage you not to do the same. I want to thank you for the quality of your attention, for your care to make it this far. We're not going to evolve as a culture without a prioritization on feminine arenas in the culture. And that's what this is. This is taking the feminine arena of healthy circle building and integrity in relationships and organizations and nonprofit and taking it very seriously and putting the kind of attention into it that most people in our culture reserve for making money. If we want to keep pretending that making money is the important thing and making relationships and making a healthy culture is kind of for losers, we will get a dysfunctional culture with dysfunctional relationships, which we already have. The first part of chauvinism is allocating the amount of respect that a feminine domain, our relationships, our loving relationships with one another, our healing relationships with one another, deserve and demand.